Welcome to Abide in Liberty, a podcast empowering patriots everywhere to re-enthrone faith, family, and freedom as the bedrock pillars of liberty in education, our communities, and our nation.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to this week's episode of Abide in Liberty. For the past 5 weeks, we've been doing a series on screens as we've gone through our No Screen November Challenge with our school here at the Liberty Youth Academy. And I have absolutely loved this series that we've done on the podcast. It's been great. I've loved having my wife Bonnie on to help me with those podcasts. And I'm kind of actually sad to see them go. We have seen so many benefits in our family and in our school students from doing this, just taking this time to separate ourselves from our screens and reevaluate how we're going to use screens going forward, that I really could just talk about this forever. I will just end and transition by saying that by taking this time to remove or limit the influence that screens have played in our kids' lives, and this is a little bit more self-introspective, limiting the role that they play in my life, I have become more and more convinced that, whereas Rome fell in large part because of bread and circus, which is free food and unlimited entertainment. So this is kind of the welfare and the entertainment state. I am convinced that screens are weakening us every day and to a greater degree than the entertainment in Rome could have ever done. The way that screens have become such a pervasive part of our culture, and really not just ours here in the United States, but throughout the world, they've become a thief of real connection between people. We went today to sing with some of the older students at our school at a retirement center. We like to go and do that about this time of year to practice some of the songs that we're going to be singing for our Christmas program. And at this retirement center, we went and sang at like 3 different parts within the unit in different wards. And in the final one, there was a TV on in the background. And this is at the end of our No Screen November fast. And we had the kids lined up in front of that facing away from it. They were facing the residents in this area. And after the singing, their attention got drawn to this TV. And there was a whole group of them. And I'm not trying to blame them. This is just kind of natural. I do this all the time. The TV's on and I just become a zombie. But they were watching this. And all that was coming on was the almost like, kind of posters of movies that are on Netflix. So it wasn't even moving. It was just, slowly transitioning from one still shot of this movie poster to another. But they were just mesmerized by it. Whereas there were residents behind them, these, great people, many of whom are, yes, kind of in the sunset phase of their lives, but have such great experiences to share, who weren't getting any interaction. And our kids were just kind of zoned out to this TV. And that, to me, was just the perfect example of what screens do to human connection. These screens are so bright, they're so pervasive that we can't even see the people sitting across the living room from us because we're so absorbed in our own world. And that was just kind of the perfect example of it. Now, we've got great students. I reminded them we were here to, be of service to the residents, and let's go chat with them. And they did, and they were fantastic. But it's just the manufacturers of these screens have done tons of research, and they're set up to be that kind of captivating and to draw our attention in that way. And it really is not good. So this, the screens have become the great thief of human connection. It's become the great thief of productivity. This is how we fall behind the rest of the world, how we lose our edge, both, in terms of military and technological prowess, but in every other facet of life. And screens also are the great thief of potential. Satan has gotten it's so ingrained in our minds that these screens are almost an unadulterated good, that he's lulled some of God's greatest, strongest spirits into thoughtless stupor, where, maybe we're not doing anything truly terrible, but we are not tapping into the divine potential that we have as sons and daughters of God. And that is a scary, scary thing when the world is descending further and further into darkness. So anyways, I said I was going to be done and not talk much about it, and here I am rambling again. But I would highly recommend, if you're jumping in now and you didn't join us for the screen fast, please go back to the first part of the series. There's 5 episodes. Listen to all of them and give it a try. I promise you, if you do, and if you jump in with both feet, you'll come out the other side of that fast with a very different lease on life and a very different perspective on yourself and on exactly how much screens are impacting you and I. Okay. That being said, I want to get back to kind of what we were doing before No Screen November set in, and that was reviewing some of the incredible miracles from the American Revolutionary time period. This is part 5. Again, if you're jumping in now, go back to part 1 and listen from the beginning. In part 1, we talk about how George Washington was miraculously preserved and protected during the French and Indian War. Part 2, we talk about how God, through the weather, intervened in many different instances to bring about the expulsion of the British from Boston. Part 3, we talk about a George Washington who was trapped and in a hopeless state on Long Island, who once again, because of the weather, were able to miraculously escape from complete annihilation from the British. Part 4, we talked about the series of miracles that led to an incredible victory at Trenton and Princeton after a long series of humiliating, morale-destroying defeats in 1776. So that's kind of where we left off. We left off actually in January of 1777 with the miracle at Princeton. And so today I want to spend a little bit more time talking about the next phase of the American Revolution in 1777. Now, coming out of winter quarters in the spring of 1777, there were many different battles and skirmishes. We could spend a lot of time going through those details. There were some victories for the United States. There were defeats for the United States. And there are a bunch of stories in here that are, quite frankly, not as well known or not as popular. They're not as big and not as flashy. But there's one example that is illustrative of the types of miracles that occurred throughout the American Revolution. Washington, when coming out of the winter of 1777, General Howe, the British commander that had, passed the winter time in New York City, decided to move on Philadelphia. They'd captured the financial center of the United States in New York City, and it was time to move on the capital, which at the time was Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. George Washington, knowing that this is where he was wanting to go, did everything he could to keep Howe from taking Philadelphia. And in one particular example, as Washington's trying to defend Philadelphia, he and his army just got clobbered. And as they're retreating, this was the perfect time for Howe to follow, to pursue, and to put an end to Washington's army. But for some inexplicable reason, he stayed put for about 7 days before he decided to go chase Washington. Well, chase him he did, and eventually he caught the Americans. And just as the Americans were turning around to face this undefeatable force that was better equipped, better trained, and just had more people than Washington had, this huge torrential downpour just opened out of the heavens. One soldier was later quoted as saying that it came down so hard that in a few moments we were drenched and sank in mud up to our calves. In a few moments, that's some serious rain. Also, during this storm, these storm clouds descended unnaturally low to the point that not only was it raining, but they couldn't even see each other. The two armies could not discern and distinguish each other. Their gunpowder was soaked, so those were useless because of the mud and the wind. A bayonet charge was infeasible. Not only that, they couldn't really tell where the opposing armies were. So rather than try and fight in those circumstances, both armies just left and got out of it. And so again, the Americans were spared another situation where in all likelihood, they would have been soundly defeated, if not completely captured in the army, and the American Revolution would have ended then and there. And these types of things were so commonplace. They happened all the time. We've already talked about some in this podcast, but we're just talking about some of the more exciting, more flashy ones, but they happened all the time. Now, as a result of these battles, Washington was defeated and the British ultimately did capture Philadelphia. This kind of took place over the course of 1777. And as the temperature started to fall again, once again, it was time for the two armies to hunker down in their winter quarters locations. The British hunkered down in Philadelphia, and there were many of the local citizens who opened their homes. And it was parties all winter long. And, the British kind of debauched themselves throughout the winter. In the meantime, Washington set up in nearby Valley Forge, and Valley Forge has come to be synonymous with ultimate suffering. Many of Washington's soldiers had no shoes, no shirts, and some even were reported as, because there was so little food, of making a soup of burnt leaves and dirt to eat. They were starving and freezing to death in this bitter, terrible Philadelphia winter, while the British were fat, dumb, and happy over in Pennsylvania. Not only that, but Washington was begging during this time Congress to intercede, to send food, to send money. This was not this famine that the Continental Army experienced during this winter was not truly necessary. The surrounding countryside was full of food, but this was a perfect example of how dangerous and impotent federal government is. The Continental Congress was begging the states to provide food, to provide taxes, but with no ability to enforce those commands. Many of the states simply didn't pay up, and as a result, many soldiers starved and froze out that winter. Washington was quoted as saying during this time, "To see men without clothes to cover their nakedness, without blankets to lay on, without shoes, by which their marches might be traced by the blood from their feet. It is a mark of patience and obedience, which in my opinion can scarce be paralleled." Nathaniel Greene, who agreed with that sentiment, added this little glimmer of sunshine to what Washington said. He said, "We bear beatings well. The more we are beat, the better we grow." And we'll see that proved to be very prophetic for the Continental Army during this time at Valley Forge. Now, Washington could have gone somewhere else. This was a miserable place, and many British commanders in his position would have found more comfortable quarters to pass the winter, even though his soldiers were going through a miserable time. But he didn't. He stayed with them. And there was one visiting clergyman who reported later that Washington during this time rode around among his army. And not only was he doing this to try and show some solidarity, to give his soldiers hope, to show that he was there with them, that he did do. But he also, as he was riding around, according to this clergyman, admonished each and every one to fear God, to put away wickedness that has set in and become so general, and to practice Christian virtues. Now, this leads to a common story that was popularized by another famous painting called The Prayer at Valley Forge, which shows Washington kneeling next to his horse in the woods. This supposedly took place during this terrible winter of Valley Forge, and it's a painting showing Washington pouring out his heart to God, asking for help, pleading on behalf of his soldiers for comfort, for relief, for anything to help. Now, there's a lot of controversy among scholars about the authenticity of that event. There was one account that was told many years after the event of a soldier stumbling across Washington in the middle of the forest praying. Another account says that instead of praying in the forest, he was praying in a barn. Both of these accounts, because they're a little bit different and contradict each other, most secular historians discredit and say probably didn't happen. In fact, one biography that I recently read on George Washington explained that, George Washington in general was not one to show his emotions, to give an outpouring of emotions in a public place. And so, it would seem very out of character for him to be found like this in a place that somebody could stumble across him praying in this way. Now, that same biographer does talk about an experience where, one soldier rushes into the little home that George Washington was using in Valley Forge as his headquarters, burst into the room and found Washington on his knees. And Alexander Hamilton replied, "Such was his constant habit." Now, this historian does give that story credit and says, look, this is more fitting to what Washington would have been doing. If, he probably was very religious, he probably was very prayerful, but he would have made sure to do that in private. Now, I don't know whether these historians are right in saying that he wasn't praying outside. I suspect, though, we in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, we have a similar story of a young man who, when needing some guidance from his Heavenly Father, was trying to find somewhere private to go to have that conversation. And it wasn't inside his home. I mean, you have to remember that homes in those days were not multi-roomed affairs with closets and all kinds of places where you can go to find solitude and solace. They were busy, they were noisy, and there was very little privacy. So where did Joseph Smith go when he needed privacy? Into the woods. Now, why would he do that where he could be stumbled upon? Well, let's also not forget that there are a lot more people in the world today than there were back then. You were much more likely to run into somebody inside a hut than you were outside in the woods. There just weren't that many people around. So again, I don't know what really happened, but if Alexander Hamilton said that it was his constant habit to be found in prayer, and if George Washington needed to get out of a busy military camp to find some solitude and solace, it is not too hard to imagine that he might have tried to get outside of that camp in order to find that space. Either way, Washington was a man of constant prayer and unshakable faith. For me, all of these stories ring true and make sense, both given what we know about Washington's faith, as well as what we know about his personality and desire to seek privacy when expressing his feelings and his emotions in this way. In any event, this winter had the ultimate effect of humbling and tempering Washington's army in a way that would be hard to replicate in any other way, all while the British grew softer and softer through their ease and their comfort back in Philadelphia. One other quick story I wanted to share, another miracle that happened during this time at Valley Forge was called the miracle of the fish. So in the middle of this winter famine, when Washington was facing the very real prospect of either holding the army together and watching his soldiers literally starve to death and dissolve before his eyes, or disbanding and giving up and quitting completely. Well, he decided to hang on. He was constantly calling on his men to, like we talked about before, to repent, to be righteous. He was constantly publicizing days of fasting and prayer. And as a result, I believe, of that faith and of those prayers, both his personal prayers and the prayers of the army as a whole, God blessed them with a miracle in the middle of this most bleak of winters. In the middle of the winter, there was this strange, very unusual thawing and warming of temperatures, so much so that the Delaware River thought out, and this kind of tricked the fish, the shad fish in that river, to think it was time for spawning. So they all come up, they flood and just fill up the Delaware River. And there are so many of them, they can't fit. So these fish start going off in these little offshoot streams and rivers, trying to find space to spawn. Well, one of those offshoot rivers was the Schuylkill River, which just so happened to run right through Valley Forge. And this stream was the perfect depth at the time for fishing and for catching fish, which they did. And they caught them by the thousands, so much so that they were able to fill their bellies then, but they were also able to salt and barrel thousands of pounds of fish to help see them through the rest of this winter famine that they were experiencing. And in writing about this miracle, Washington said, "Providence has a just claim to my humble and grateful thanks for its protection and direction of me through the many difficult and intricate scenes which this contest has produced, and for its constant interposition in our behalf when the clouds were heaviest and seemed ready to burst upon us." And this outpouring of gratitude to God, supposedly from a secular deist, I don't think so. As I hear this story, I'm reminded of the children of Israel being fed with manna in the wilderness, of the early Mormon pioneers settling in the Salt Lake Valley. And when they're on the brink of starvation after having sacrificed everything to follow God into the wilderness, they're blessed with just this outpouring of quail from heaven. I'm also reminded of, the cruse of oil that never failed. I'm reminded of Christ multiplying the loaves and the fishes. God really likes food miracles. And I wonder why that is. I wonder if it could be because he likes to remind us who we should be relying on for our constant daily nourishment. So a couple of lessons that I took from this story about Valley Forge and from the miracles that happened there. Number one is that God takes care of his people. There is no miracle too small or too big. I also see in here the miracle of unanswered prayers. This is one of my favorite songs of all time. It's a song by Garth Brooks. If you don't know it or haven't heard it in a while, I recommend that you listen to it. But the chorus goes, "Sometimes I thank God for unanswered prayers. Remember, when you're talking to the man upstairs, that just because he may not answer doesn't mean he don't care. Sometimes I thank God for unanswered prayers." I'm sure Washington and every soldier in that frigid camp were begging for relief, were begging for food, and they were blessed with food, but begging for warmer weather, begging for clothes and warm clothes, and some of those prayers were never answered. As they heard reports of how comfortable the British were in Philadelphia, I'm sure they prayed and wished that they could be in that same position. But what they didn't realize until after that trial was over was that the Valley Forge became a crucible that hardened the Continental Army into a fighting force that was much better prepared for the next spring campaign than the British were after the ease that they had enjoyed in Philadelphia. Also during the time in Valley Forge, this, German soldier came over and volunteered to help whip the army into shape. And he did. He drilled them. He gave them purpose as they were limping through the final stages of this freezing winter. And when they came out and they had their first battle with the British were shocked at how well disciplined they were and just how tough as nails these men were. This was hard. Many died. But this is exactly what the American Revolution needed to continue and push through the next phase of this conflict. Sometimes we are blessed and given the miracle of going through difficult times that strengthen us and prepare us to become better tools in God's hands. And it may be tough while we go through that, but I hope we all get through it. I hope we all get through it and then can look back and, like Mr. Garth Brooks in that song, thank God that our prayers weren't answered the way that we wanted them to be answered. Washington certainly looked back and saw the benefits that came from this difficult time. I'm also amazed at how complete Washington's trust in God was. There was no other reason other than a complete trust that God was in control for him to have continued through all of these impossible difficulties. And not only did he just trust that, look, God's going to make something happen here. I have no idea where the food's coming. My soldiers are in a terrible position, but it's going to be okay somehow. And we're going to stick it out. I don't know. The faith that would take is absolutely staggering for me to think about. When I get simple answers to prayer and I start moving forward, I take 2 steps down the road and then I start second guessing myself and I'm plagued by doubt and all of these things. I just am floored at how he just pressed forward, trusting in God completely. And he was willing to do it so much that he willingly threw himself into harm's way if it meant trying to rally his army to fight a little bit longer or to stop their retreat. I mean, there's all kinds of stories of horses being shot out from under him. We talked about the stories from the French and Indian War where his coat was full of bullet holes. There's a story of him, talking to one of his colonels in this really exposed position, a cannonball exploding at the feet of his horse and kicking up dirt and messing up his, wig and everything. He was a mess. And he just continued talking unflinchingly. He was so confident that whatever happened was okay and that God was in it, that he was completely heedless of any peril to his own person. As I look and I think about these stories, God was definitely the author of this great country, and he wants to help it continue. And we need this kind of faith to fix the problems ahead. I'm not aware of any time since the founding of our nation when we've been so weak as we are now. At the founding of our country, we were small, we were weak, we didn't have a real Navy or Army to speak of. At the end of the war, we had a large war debt, nothing compared to what we've got now, but the economy was a shambles. But our faith, the collective faith of this country in God, was strong. I was recently, actually just yesterday, talking with a friend about all the problems that our country faces. And he compared kind of where we are now with the Roaring 20s. And the Roaring 20s, was this great time of societal advancement. We thought we could walk on water and that things would be great forever from now on. And then it wasn't that much longer before this great stock market crash of 1929 happened where, people who had borrowed money in order to invest in the stock market, all of a sudden that bubble popped. Their stock values plummeted. They were unable to pay back their loans. Banks collapsed, and it drove us into a decade of severe poverty. We got the Dust Bowl with all that. I mean, it was just a terrible, terrible time. And he was comparing it with, where we are now with the Roaring 20s. And so we may have a correction. It may be really painful like the Depression, but ultimately it's going to be okay. And today, as I look at what's going on, we do have economic problems like they had back in the 20s. We've got rampant inflation. We've got supply issue problems, still recovering from COVID where we can't get enough building materials. So that's driving the prices up. We've got, the Fed's raising interest rates, trying to control inflation, which is stagnating the economy and stalling the housing market. We got all these problems that are not good economically. But what we have now that they didn't have in the 1920s is a whole other slew of problems. We've got depleted oil reserves, which was a political ploy to try and keep gas prices low. We've depleted our stockpiles of ammunition. Our army is focused on socialist policies rather than on war readiness. The moral fabric of our society is completely decayed. The family is all but obliterated. Our society is completely decoupled from reality in terms of basic things like gender. There's war popping up all over the place, and we're getting involved in all of them. And a couple of these have nuclear powers and either directly involved or involved on the fringes. We have a $34 trillion debt, which is an astronomically large number, especially compared with the fact that our annual GDP is only $23 trillion. We have a welfare state that's out of control, people that don't want to work because it's easier to collect welfare. We have most of our national budget going to these entitlement programs. We are lazier, more self-centered, and we've been lulled to sleep with endless entertainment. And the government has ballooned into a behemoth. All of these problems are too big for us to solve, just like all of the problems and all the challenges that Washington faced were too big for him at that time. And the only thing that gets us through it is complete humility and reliance on God. There is no other option. We need the faith of Washington, where we can stare these insurmountable obstacles in the face and say, we're going to make it. We're going to humble ourselves. We're going to beg for help from the God of the universe, and he will intervene and show us the way. And when we can't navigate that way ourselves, he will bring food to our doorstep. He will make the weather work in our behalf to drive back our enemies. He will part the Red Sea for us if we are righteous enough to deserve his help. That's it. That is the only answer. That is the only avenue that we have left to us. And we can either choose to humble ourselves, or that humbling can be thrust upon us. But compelled humility is never as much fun as choosing it for ourselves. Now, I know I keep coming back to this answer that God is the solution. That's because he is. It's not lazy to rely on faith in God. It's not a cop-out. This is the formula of the founding of this country. It's way harder to say, Jesus, take the wheel, to turn it over to God and admit that we've screwed up big time and that we need his help. Now, at a national level, doing this for everybody in the country and expecting our leaders to do this and help inspire all the rest of us to do it, that's a pretty tall order, especially in the godless society that we've allowed to take root. We may not be able to fix the whole country, but we can fix our families. And then we can help fix those around us. We can help teach and inspire those around us to follow our lead. And if that's not going to be good enough, he'll inspire us to know what to do to prepare to weather the storm that is coming, unless we have a nationwide repentance. And we have to be okay to look a little crazy, like Noah building the ark, to have people look at us and scratch their heads and wonder why we're doing what we're doing. We got to be okay with that. But I know we can do it. I know we can. If not on a national level, at least at a local level. All right, that's all for today. Make sure to please like and subscribe, or click whatever notification bell, whatever, sends positive vibes our way and helps boost these videos and these podcasts and the algorithm. That would be great. We need the people in this country to hear these stories and to rekindle our faith in the God who gave us the freedoms that we have today. We'll see you next week.
Thank you for listening to Abide in Liberty. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes, and share this with friends and family. In the meantime, keep up with the show online at abideinliberty.com. Also, if you'd like to help our K-12 bless and educate more families, contact us by visiting libertyyouthacademy.org. Until next time, be on the alert, stand firm in the faith, and be strong.